Morning, everybody. How many of you have ever tried to change somebody else's mind? Rather probably apt at the moment. How do you go about it? Do you take your logical reasoned way of doing it? Are you a logical-based person? Do you try to show that the other person is being illogical? Or maybe you try and show them that the output of what they think is a good idea is not such a good idea, and you try to show them benefits from your perspective. Now, that could be from just about any decision you may be thinking about, what you're going to eat, where you're going to go on holiday, where you might live, or, of course, politics. But we won't go further there now. And if you've got children and you try to get your children to do their homework or prepare for exams, wonder how you've done with that one, do you sort of say to them all the benefits? Well, if you do this homework now, then something else better will happen later, like maybe you'll get good exam results or whatever you need to get. I wonder how your children have pushed back. I've got 3 children, but thankfully those days are gone. I can't say that I was particularly very able to persuade my children that homework was a good idea. I would get that little book out at the end of the day. We're going to read this when they were small. Then when they were bigger, and it was music practice, I remember ages trying to get my son to learn scales. But anyway, how do we go about it? Well, in this passage that we've been unpacking over the last few weeks, we have observed Paul, a master of logic, trying to get the Corinthian church folks there to realize that they had been illogical. They had reasoned from their own perspective, but Paul was saying to them, you really are not understanding what has happened before as Jesus was resurrected. They basically had a view that flesh was bad, spirit was good, therefore the idea of the resurrection needed to be a spiritual one, not a fleshly one. They didn't like that concept because they had their own worldview. But Paul goes on to say, as we have been unpacking it over the last few weeks, well, Jesus was a real body when he came back from the dead. And so why would you not believe, therefore, he has said to them, that you too will be raised in a fleshly way, but a spiritual way? And he's been really trying to get them to realize their way of thinking was faulty. It's not comfortable when we're told we're wrong, is it? And I don't suppose these Corinthians particularly liked being told, you've got it wrong, folks. But he wasn't just doing it because he was wanting to look clever, because he wanted to win an argument, because actually he's saying if you don't understand what the resurrection is going to be like, you're going to be living your life now in a way that isn't as good as it needs to be. Because your life on earth now is a gift. He's not saying it's not important. It was important. But how you live now, in some ways, depends on what you think is going to happen later. And he was trying to say to them, you need to understand the truth and not just go with what you've already decided as a social grouping of people there. They were being very influenced by their society. Often so are we. It's a challenge. How many of us have conversations about spiritual things? And if you do, you may have heard all sorts of people make all sorts of statements about what they believe God is like, what they believe will happen after we die. And we as Christians need to be assured that we understand this, and that's what this passage that we're just about to go to is all about. And I really like the way Paul starts off this passage. So it's in 1 Corinthians 15, if you want to open up, turn on, however you're reading it. I'm going to be reading from the NIV today, just because of the flow of it. And the way that Paul starts off this message is he has an imaginary questioner asking him questions. It's like he's saying, that this questioner is sitting there as he speaks, and they've listened to all his logical reasoning, and they've kind of semi-got that maybe. And then they probably say something like, okay, I get your argument, but let's be real about this, shall we? How's this actually going to land in ordinary life? How is this resurrection going to happen? How are the dead raised to life? What sort of body will it be? Very practically earthed questions. And I think that these are the sort of questions that people today also will be asking if we dig a little deeper, because there is a lot of uncertainty about the life to come, which is why I think it's important that we look at this. So we're starting at verse 35 in 1 Corinthians 15. So here we go. Someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals another, birds another, and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies, and there are earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another. And stars differ from star in splendor. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it's written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, and the second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth. And as is the heavenly man, so are those who are of heaven. And just as we've been born the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. We thank God for his word. So let's look at what Paul's saying. He starts off with those two questions. How are the dead raised? Before he goes on to the second. And Paul answers in a way that doesn't sound particularly kind, because he says, how foolish you are, or fools, it says in some translations. Not exactly a term of endearing to a conversation when you're told how foolish you are. Don't like being told I'm foolish at any point. But the image here is coming out of how people in the Old Testament would very much understand the word fool or foolish. Because in that background, anybody who didn't understand in God, didn't believe there to be a God, a powerful God, a creator God, would be called a fool. So if we understand that's why he's actually answering this way, because he's basically saying to them, it's only a valid question if you don't believe in a powerful God. If you do believe in a powerful God, then why are you actually questioning things just because you can't understand how it happens? So he is saying to them, you need to know there's a powerful God. They didn't become created beings by their own ability. They didn't know how to make a body like you and I have a body, because God made us. We are created from him, from the dust of the earth, originally we're told in Genesis. And so in the same way as we cannot imagine how God made the first Adam, we don't need to understand with our mind how it's possible. But I think this ends up sometimes being a very practical, pastoral question for us. Because I know when I visit people who are heading towards the end of their life, and we're unpacking, what do they want to happen at their funeral? What do they want to happen next? Do they want to be cremated, or do they want to be buried? The discussion sometimes goes around, well, what's going to happen if I'm cremated? Then I just turn to ash. And then how can it possibly be that God would raise up my body, because we scatter the ashes? And it can sound like a morbid conversation, but actually it can lead to a really positive reality, because actually we don't understand how God created all things. But therefore we don't need to fear that when we die, our bodies will be recreated, because God is the God of power. So we can be assured God is big enough, powerful enough, enabled enough to do this for everybody. he then goes on to the second question about what sort of body in verse 37. And then he basically says to them, look, folks, look around you. They are people who work, live in an agricultural world. They understand about things being planted, about seeds, and that the seed doesn't look anything like the plant that comes from it. I brought my visual aid, as I do like to do, and this is a green bean. And I plant these in little pots around April time. And after about 2 weeks, if I've planted them in nice moist soil and put it in the back of my lounge where there's nice glass and so it's warm, after about 2 weeks, I end up with one of these. Now, not that fast, it comes up slowly. But if you actually observe what happens to a bean, the out part comes off and the two parts open up and a little growth comes out the top and the roots go down. Now we all think, yes, of course we understand that. But don't you think that's amazing? I look at that, so it's quite hard, doesn't feel fleshy, doesn't look very alive, and yet in the right environment, it becomes a green bean plant. And at the end of the season, after it produces lots of beans, this is a shriveled up one. Inside of here, so I at the end, after I've grown them, I leave some on the plant so that I can, the next year, take out the bean, there's another one, and plant it the following year. So that's how I keep producing. I actually brought some spare plants with me, but most of them seem to have been taken. So somebody else can enjoy the green beans. But he's basically using that sort of image, saying you don't understand how a bean, a seed, turns into a plant, but it does, and you know it does. And so Paul goes on to say, all of you have a different type of body, and that's like the seed, the bean, and what's going to happen to you next is not going to be what you may expect, because you can't imagine how one turns into the other. So he gets them to think about all the people, the animals, the birds, the fish. He says they are all different. Yes. Then he says, he looks up to the skies and he says the triad, the sun, moon, the stars, they're all different, but they are made to be in exactly where they were meant to be. I don't know if you've ever watched a fisherman. I was listening to a fisherman on the radio this week, and he was describing what happens when he takes a fish out of the water, and he's particularly proud of it, and he wants a photograph, and he holds the fish, and it's flapping about because it doesn't like being out of the water. And he says, it flips, and it's not its natural environment. But then as soon as you put it back in the water, it swims off. It's graceful. It can go fast. Out of its environment, it doesn't do well. We might like swimming, but we wouldn't be able to live in the water. So Paul's argument is basically, you know for yourselves, there are different places for different people, different animals, and each is created specifically for where it needs to be. So he then goes on to say in verses 43 and 44 that the body that we have now is very different to the one that is to come. I think we would understand this. The earthly body is perishable, so it's inevitably going to die. One of the obvious things for all human beings is that we only have our existence on earth for a short period of time. That might be scary. I remember when I was a little girl, around 5, thinking about these big thoughts of life and death. And in my mind, somehow I thought, no, I'm not going to die. Because that was my way of going against the fear. I didn't want to believe it. But the reality is that the next body won't die. We will go on into an imperishable. It talks about we are sown in dishonor and it's raised in glory. I'll come back to that in a minute. The earthly body was weak, he says, but it will be raised up powerful. This is good news, folks. The one sown is natural, based on nature in this created order, but the next is going to be of a spiritual. It's different. So what does it mean that we're sown in dishonor and raised in glory? It's basically sown in brokenness. We know that when people die, there is a dissemination of the cells, but they are going to be raised up again in a new body where it will be glorified. It will be of a different essence. Now, I don't think any of us obviously doubt the reality that as we get older, our bodies don't do the things that we wish they did. We remember back to when we were youthful and we think, I wish I was like that. Because I used to like playing tennis and squash and badminton. I could do that for hours and the next day I'd be fine. If I try to do those things today, by tomorrow I'm going to really ache. My body is nowhere near as able, the joints just do not work as they used to. And the reality is that we become, as we get older, kind of a shadow of our former self. And we might wish we weren't. Reality is, according to a book recently that I read by Professor John Wyatt, if you really want the sad decline, this is happy time, everybody. In your 20s, after your 20s, your brain, your lungs, and your skin start to deteriorate. In your 30s, your muscles, hair, and bones start to decline. In your 40s, it's your eyes, your heart, and your teeth. In your 50s, your guts, your kidneys, and your hearing. Sorry? And in your 60s, your bladder, your voice and taste and smell start to decline. And in your 70s, it's your liver. How are you feeling? That doesn't sound very happy, does it? But the reality is we are not meant to fear this because we will have another body that is imperishable. And that should be something that can encourage us. We live in a society that often doesn't like talking about death. People have all sorts of unusual ideas of what they think will happen, where they will go to. We should be people who have an assurance that we have a new body to come, so we do not need to be afraid of the fact that this is the process that we are going to go through. The body we have next is fit for purpose. No more sickness. No more aches and pains. No more hardships. I think we can all go, that will be wonderful. Now we have an example of this resurrected body. And at the end of the Gospels, we hear about how Jesus came back with a resurrected body. And it was some ways similar, but a lot of ways very different. So at the end of Luke, it talks about where there was a journey from Jerusalem to a place called Emmaus. And there were two people walking along, and all of a sudden they were met by another person. At that point, they did not know this was the resurrected Jesus. They walked and talked until they got to a place where they stopped. And then they started to have some food together. They said to this man, please stay, because the way you were telling us about the scriptures is amazing. We want you to stay. It wasn't until they started to eat that they suddenly had their eyes opened, it says, and they realized this was Jesus. And the moment they realized it, he disappeared. Whoa, that would have been a bit scary. But for the time that they had Jesus in their company, they had no doubt he was real. So real that they basically ran back, or went back as fast as they could, back to Jerusalem, went to find the other disciples to say, Jesus is alive. Just like the women said, Jesus really is alive. If you can remember or imagine what it would have been like, you thought this man you'd walked with, talked with, learnt from, had said great things would happen, and then he was killed. You'd be so downhearted. And then these two disciples come into the room and say, seriously, folks, Jesus really is alive. He has a new body. We've seen him. We've spoken to him. And at that moment, Jesus comes into the room. The reality is this new resurrected body does not walk in the same way all the time. He can travel through walls. That's pretty amazing. He talks to those disciples. He says to them, peace be with you, because he knows they're terrified. He tells them, you can touch me. I'm not a ghost, he says. He says, I have flesh and bones. And then he eats fish, broiled fish. Doesn't sound very lovely, but obviously it was there. That's what they're eating. So he eats. So Jesus is like and yet unlike. his body from before. So we can have confidence that our bodies in the next life will be in some ways the same and in some ways completely different. It's the best body for what you need. So it's going to not be perishable. It won't get weary. It's going to be powerful. It will show in its very essence, glorifying of the God that created it. It's a body that goes on forever because there is an eternal aspect. I don't think as human beings can really get our head around eternity, because it can almost sometimes sound like, well, is it just ongoing forever and ever and ever? I mean, how's that good? But actually, in the presence of God, being with God is unbelievably good. We get these images. I feel like we're trying to grapple with something in 2 dimensions that is actually 3 dimensions, and therefore we don't really have the language to explain it. But we know from what we see of Jesus' resurrected body and the way he was, and his promises to us that we're going to be with him, that this is a good thing. It's an eternal body. So I don't know what heaven will be like. Are we all going to be running marathons without getting tired? You know, should you wish to go marathon running? What is it that you're looking forward to in this new place? You are going to be purposeful. The new heaven, the new earth, it's going to have purpose. We are going to be enabled to do life in a different way. So our spiritual body, as it has flesh and bones, but it's no longer restricted by time and physical things like walls. It's a transformed body. Just after this passage in verse 50, which Dave next week will pick up on, it talks about that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, as in this flesh and blood, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. But just like this being is a manifestation of something to come, so we will go on and then inherit the fullness of God's kingdom. We're talking terms that I think we don't understand how amazing it is, but folks, it's amazing that you will have a new life with Jesus. If you are a follower of Jesus, you have a certainty that you've got a made-to-measure body going to be made just for you, where you will be more alive than you have ever been on this planet, even at your best. So therefore, death is not to be feared. I still think, I know, as Christians, we still try to grapple with this, and the idea of ending, leaving the people we love, is hard. It's hard when we see people we love pass away. But we can have a certainty, if they're a follower of Jesus and we're a follower of Jesus, we will see each other again. We will know each other. We will talk with each other. We may eat broiled fish together. We will be in relationship with each other in a way that we probably can't imagine, but it's going to be rich and good, and everything that we have kind of ached for on this planet Earth living that we've never really had. We're told in other parts of Scripture, Matthew 6, that we should be living this life with a clear sight of what is before us. We're told not to store up treasures on earth, to store up instead for treasures on heaven, because that is the life to come. This life is a bit like a heart monitor when you see the heart rhythm and you get a little blip and then it's a gap and then it's another little blip. We're just one blip on the vastness of eternity. We've got something forever to come. So we are meant to enjoy and be all that we can be on this planet now, but there's so much more. Yet does this give us the confidence to talk about these things with other people who don't yet know Jesus? Are we able to say with confidence, I know I'm going to have a new body because Jesus had a new body? Hundreds of people saw Jesus in his resurrected body. This is not a figment of our imagination. This is true. Jesus is alive in a human form, yet a spiritual form. We will go to be with him when we pass away from this life. So we do need to be people who can be confident and know that we have a life to come that we need to share now with people that we're living alongside who may have all sorts of odd ideas. And therefore, although we're not going to be logical and brilliant like Paul was in maybe reasoned argument, we can share within our own ability that there is a much better life, but that it comes through Jesus. It is as we say yes to Jesus that we have that option then to see our life before us in a very different way to how it's been up till now. And so today, I would just want you to know this is your life to come if you know Jesus. So it's good to be excited about that reality as you enjoy your day today, this weekend, this bank holiday, hopefully with lovely sunny weather. But whatever heaven is like, it's this and massively more. So be encouraged.